Yeah, when you start a podcast, it's good to know two things. Firstly, your motivations, and secondly, your audience. Let's start with motivations. Now, you can have internal motivations to start a podcast. You can start a podcast because you enjoy it. You like talking to people like Prince Kumar. You like connecting with people. These are all good reasons. However, if you're doing it in business and you have a budget to do it, then you need to know the external motivations, which are the business cases for creating a podcast. How will this podcast impact my business positively? And I have a guide. I wrote a guide. It's free. So, only to educate people at podcastingforbrands.com. It just talks about the 4 business cases for a podcast. You can use a podcast um, as business development to get leads. You can use a podcast for thought leadership to lead your category. You can use a podcast for news and analysis, and you can use a podcast for campaign awareness. If you have a project, you want to raise awareness of that project. So the main thing now is, if you start a podcast, know what the business case for that podcast is, because after 6 episodes, you will find that the motivation starts to drop, and it's not so exciting anymore. And now you have to work. So you have to have a really good reason why you're doing this. So the first part is know your motivations for doing it. The second part, advice, is know your audience. You should know your audience before you start a podcast. The mistake that most people make when they start a podcast is they start a podcast and they don't know who they're talking to. Your audience shouldn't be the listeners. Your audience shouldn't be everybody out there. Your audience should be you. When you speak to your audience, you speak to one person. You must know who they are, what is their name, how old they are, what their job role is, what's their pain points, what's their problems, why do they listen to you, what's their worries right now. Always speak to that person. Maybe there's thousands of them, but speak like a radio show. A radio host always speaks to you directly. And that's what we need to do in podcasts. If you don't know who that person is, then ask, talk to people, talk to your sales guys, talk to your employees, find out, who do I need to talk to? But please don't start a podcast until you know exactly who you're talking to, because the podcast won't go in the right direction. Over time, it gets distracted, or over time, now there's so much competition in podcasting that you need to know exactly who you're going to talk to. So those are the 2 pieces of advice, Prince. One is motivations, know the business case. Second is know exactly who you're talking to. Give them a name. My podcast audience, she's called Nicole. She's 42 years old. She's a corporate communications leader, and she listens to me because she needs to sell podcasts internally. When I do a podcast, I always think, Nicole, I'm speaking to her. Just like, in marketing, when you write copy, you always think about, who am I writing this for, right? A pen profile, as they call it, right?